Hey there, did you know that the United States is actively trying to start a war with China right now? I'm not talking about the constant stream of threats or the arming all of China's neighbors. That stuff's normal. No, I'm talking about something new, a premeditated attempt by the US government to undermine the very foundation of US-China peace. It started as almost kind of a joke in the final days of the Trump administration, but the Biden administration has just picked up the ball and kept running with it. And nobody's talking about this. To explain the truly radical nature of this Trump-Biden policy, we have to do some history. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the US was the main sponsor of the Chinese government under a guy named Kai-Shek. He was our brave ally against the Japanese and the communists, but the more I read about him, the more he seems like that Afghan government that evaporated last week. He wasn't quite that bad, but if you read Barbara Tuchman, it seems like he was running a government that was insanely corrupt and that most Chinese people were miserable under his rule. After the Japanese withdrew, civil war with the communists sparked back up, and Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists lost miserably. The remnants of his army and government fled to Taiwan, a small island off the coast that China had just won back from Japan after 50 years. Despite his colossal failure, Chiang got to live in his own private fiefdom for another quarter century, and after his death, one of the grandest monuments on the planet was dedicated to his memory. The US wasn't willing to fight to prop him up in China, but it was relatively easy to use the Navy to set him up in Taiwan, so that's what we did. In the 1980s, after Chiang's death, Taiwan did finally go democratic, and thanks to the economic rise of the Chinese mainland, Taiwan has become one of the most impressive civilizations on the planet. I do believe that what Taiwan has is worth defending, but it's important to remember that it did start out as the refuge of a failed dictator, and that China's mainland government sees Taiwan's status as deeply insulting unfinished business. For over 2 decades, from the late 1940s until the 1970s, the United States pretended that the island of Taiwan was China, even reserving China's UN Security Council seat for Taiwan. By the late 1960s, though, Communist China had not just had a falling out with the Soviet Union, they had even had a minor shooting war with the Russians. Both Washington, D.C. and Beijing wanted to find a way to work more closely together against the Soviet Union. Taiwan was the major stumbling block, though. China couldn't accept the United States having close relations with its old nemesis, and the United States couldn't just give up on its long-standing anti-communist ally. The ingenious answer was to simply not talk about it. The policy of strategic ambiguity was first laid out in the Shanghai Communique of 1972. There have been a number of clarifications since, but the bare bones of the strategy remained in place from 1972 until January of 2021. The US continued to arm and support Taiwan, we just didn't openly acknowledge that we were doing so. All manner of political and especially economic ties continued to strengthen, but until the Trump administration, we didn't have any direct diplomatic contacts. This weird accommodation was acceptable to both sides, with ongoing nitpicking and occasional flare-ups for almost 50 years. The details are important here. We acknowledged that the mainland has a one China policy, but we don't endorse that policy. We don't support Taiwanese independence or self-determination, but we don't oppose it either. The US is intentionally vague about whether it would support Taiwan if China invaded. With strategic ambiguity, we continue to arm Taiwan without insulting China. This may seem faintly ridiculous, and to be honest, it totally is, but this silly policy has been the bedrock foundation of 50 years of extraordinary Asian prosperity. And not just for everybody else, but for Taiwan itself as well. Taiwanese companies build most of the world's iPhones, but they build them in factories on the communist Chinese mainland. I think you can make a pretty good argument that Taiwanese democracy wouldn't have been possible without the prosperity generated by the policy of strategic ambiguity. Challenging this policy is insane. So of course it was one of the first things Donald Trump did after he was elected. Even before he was inaugurated, Trump started toying with strategic ambiguity by openly flaunting a congratulatory phone call from Taiwan's president. Once he was actually in office, though, he laid off. He recognized that he could make more progress on trade and everything else if he left this radioactive topic alone. But he decided to make a revolution in Taiwan policy one of his parting fuck yous to the Biden administration. Parting shots are nothing new in U.S. politics. In January 1969, the departing Johnson administration famously launched a sweeping antitrust case against IBM 2 weeks before the more pro-business Nixon administration came into office. What was strange about what Trump and Mike Pompeo did, though, was the amount of foreign policy that they dragged into this. Longtime viewers will remember how much I flipped out over their Yemen vandalism, but the Yemen thing was nowhere near the most chaotic thing they did. On January 9th, 2021, 11 days before Biden's inauguration, Trump's Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, removed all restrictions on the U.S. State Department's interactions with Taiwan. This was a direct attack on the very foundation of U.S.-China relations and the past half-century of Asian prosperity. It wasn't full recognition, but with U.S. officials and cabinet members now encouraged to visit Taiwan in an official capacity, the Chinese wouldn't be crazy to think U.S.-supported independence could be coming soon. It's insanely dangerous stuff. Biden quickly reversed Trump and Pompeo's Yemen vandalism, but 8 months later, U.S. Taiwan policy and the policy of strategic ambiguity that has underpinned almost 50 years of U.S.-China peace remains completely up in the air. Biden is letting Taiwan creep into his speeches in ways that former presidents never would have done. U.S. defense industry lobbyists are talking about a clear commitment to Taiwan or strategic clarity, something that would have been seen as guaranteeing World War III as recently as 5 years ago. Last week, I had a relatively successful tweet mocking a much more popular Twitter account for thinking that Afghanistan withdrawal might lead China to invade Taiwan. The US government has been selling us fantasies of Chinese invasions of Taiwan for decades, but after sending this mocking tweet, I decided to look into it more deeply. And now I think the paranoid Twitter guy may be onto something. Having researched it, I now do believe that there's a serious danger of China invading Taiwan. Not because of Afghanistan, but because the United States, this year under both Trump and Biden, has been making a concerted move away from strategic ambiguity. It is mind-blowing that more people aren't talking about this. Why is the US government taking such an aggressive position, and why is nobody talking about it? Well, what I think we may be seeing here is sort of the twilight of a dying myth. The US government, the US military-industrial complex, and the US media it owns all desperately want a new Cold War with China. They've been working really hard to bring one about. And as I've mentioned before, the project isn't going very well. The US government has been working really hard trying to make rivalry with China a thing. We spent decades building them up into a manufacturing powerhouse. While the rest of us were distracted by the orange plague we had elected president, the Pentagon did its big, great power competition launch, and it's honestly pretty underwhelming. The US media is doing its usual job of photocopying Pentagon press releases, but there's only so much they can do with reality. We are spending trillions upon trillions of dollars to keep China from exerting any influence in the South China Sea, despite the fact that China has the exact same interest in open sea lanes that we do. We are also spending $1 trillion to expand our nuclear arsenal, despite the fact that, depending on how you measure it, we have somewhere between 20 and 100 times more nuclear weapons than China does. None of this makes any sense. The only way to make it look like China threatens the United States is if you define U.S. interests as starting about 10 miles off of China's coastline, which the usual cast of lobbyists are right now working very hard to do. Screwing with strategic ambiguity over Taiwan is a last desperate attempt to provoke some seriously aggressive behavior out of China. The US media isn't talking about this because they want to make damn sure that if China does something, they look crazy and aggressive, not the United States. This is a playbook they've been using for at least a decade, taking a number of failed initiatives and pitiful reactions and trumping them up as if they're Hitler-level aggression. There are a number of scare stories that are ridiculous if you look at them for like 5 minutes. There's the idea that dumping concrete into the South China Sea is somehow power projection, or the Belt and Road infrastructure plan that even most mainstream media sources agree has flopped almost entirely. There's the trade advantages and opportunity for intellectual property theft that the United States very much made a political decision to voluntarily give to China. There is a class of crimes that China is unquestionably committing. There's no explaining away the horrors of Xinjiang or Hong Kong, or the fact that China has now fallen back into a sort of one-man autocracy. But it's important to acknowledge what's actually happening here. These actions are the desperate lashings out of a failing system that is terrified. And China is right to be terrified. The United States is the world's most powerful country, and its past 3 presidents have been denouncing China with ever-increasing severity. First, we had the good cop, who only heavily armed an ever-growing list of China's neighbors and sought to close down China's foreign trade miracle with the TPP. Then we had the bad cop, who screamed angrily about how he was going to brutalize China for 4 straight years. And now Joe Biden, the responsible return to normalcy, is cheerfully throwing out the basis of US-China relations for the past 50 years. China's leadership is often described as paranoid, but it's not paranoia to think that we are out to get them. Every recent US president has loudly proclaimed that we are out to get them. Washington, D.C. desperately wants a wider conflict with China, and China keeps disappointing us. China's actions in Xinjiang and Hong Kong are disgusting, but they are Chinese actions taken in China in a desperately miscalculated effort to defend Chinese security. Despite all the opportunities the U.S. has provided, China has refused to engage in any lucrative proxy warring in Africa or Myanmar. And I suspect this is why the Biden administration is taking our half-century-old Taiwan policy and setting it on fire. Washington, D.C. really wants to get this Cold War started in earnest. Cold War with China? Hot war with China? Either way is a great way for Washington, D.C. to make more money. So maybe I owe that Twitter guy an apology. I think it's for different reasons, but yeah, if anything we have been told about China's capabilities and intentions is true, then an invasion of Taiwan should be imminent. If anything we have been told about China's red lines over the past 50 years is true, then they should be invading Taiwan very soon. Not because of Afghanistan, but because the US has been working hard to provoke China on this issue all year long. There is another possibility, though. Beijing and Washington, D.C. could have involuntarily collaborated on a myth of Chinese power. If China hasn't invaded Taiwan by the end of 2021, then maybe, just maybe, the new Cold War is just as much of a mirage as the Afghan military was. And if that's true, then we have wasted far, far more on defense spending than just the $2 trillion that went up in smoke in Afghanistan last week. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and click here to sign up for my email newsletter, which I'm trying to get out a little more often. Thanks.